Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Cultural Exchange. I am Stanley Miller, the grad assistant for the Center for Multicultural Affairs here at Duke University. And a few months ago, myself and Michelle Kwan of the Women's Center here at Duke interviewed Dr. Ariana Vigil, the chair of the Women's and Gender Study Department at UNC Chapel Hill, as part of a joint episode for our podcast. So, what you're about to hear is our insightful conversation with Dr. Vigil. So, enjoy.
Welcome everybody to our next episode of the Femmepod, also with Stanley here from the CMA for his podcast as well. Stanley, if you want to introduce yourself.
Well, hello everybody. I am Stanley. I'm the grad assistant for the Center for Multicultural Affairs at Duke, and I'm so excited to be doing this podcast with Michelle. Michelle is showing me the ropes, so thank you for agreeing to do the joint episode with me.
And we're so excited to have Professor Vigil here. If you want to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. My name is Ariana Vigil. I'm a professor here at UNC Chapel Hill, and I am chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and I'm also affiliated with the program in Latino Studies.
Yes, we're so excited to have you here, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our first joint episode. The Femmepod has established as per episode. This is the first time we did a joint episode, so thank you for agreeing to be on our podcast this episode with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right. So, I guess we'll get to the first question. We noted a lot of your research is centered heavily on Latinx identity, literature, and culture, often in a transnational context throughout your academic career. What inspired you to pursue research centered on those themes?
Great. Thank you for the question. So I'll sort of offer my academic biography. So I was somebody, as a student, as an undergrad, I was always really interested in literature. I was really interested in feminism and social justice. So that's what I studied as an undergrad. I majored in English and I minored in women's and gender studies. And towards the end of my undergraduate, I had the opportunity to do a summer research mentorship with a professor in the English department. And so I started exploring something that I hadn't been able to explore because there weren't classes at the time, which were looking at Latino literature. So I had taken classes in African-American literature that was sort of more available, and that was interesting to me because I was able to explore questions of race and class and gender. But at that time where I was studying, there really weren't, what we would call now Latinx literature courses. So I was able to do that as an honors thesis. And so I was encouraged to go to graduate school. So I entered graduate school in the early 2000s. And I was interested in sort of joining my, this area of study of Latinx literature, Latino literature, and then I was really interested in activism. So I was somebody who, this was so like late 90s, early 2000s, was an era that we would refer to as globalization, and there was a lot of anti-globalization activism happening. So if you'd ever heard about like the Seattle protests and sort of major protests against the World Bank, the IMF, all of these really powerful organizations that impact a lot of people's lives. And that was something that had really formed me. And I was really interested in looking at transnational activism. And then I was also interested in Latinx studies. And so when I got to grad school, I wanted to try to see if I could meld those two things and if I could look at literature and culture and transnational activism. And I think I've been generally successful, but that was the impetus. That was where I came out of.
Wow. Do you find that this field of research that you were inspired to pursue based on experiences, do you find this to be understudied in academia in any capacity? And what has your research and writing process been like for recent works where you expanded on this research area, such as your recent book chapter?
Okay, so I think it's changed a lot, right? So I started grad school like over 20 years ago. So in that time, I think the field has really changed. And even in the time that I was in grad school, I was really, I think, quite lucky in that I entered grad school, and by the time I left grad school 7 years later, there were jobs in Latino literature that I think hadn't even existed when I entered. And so there is an increased interest And so you can just look at, there are programs with Latino studies, minors and majors, and sometimes that looks a little bit different, right? So like you might find on the East Coast, like Black and Puerto Rican studies, versus on the West Coast, it might be called Chicano studies. Like the departments and the exact labels differ, but there's definitely just been a growth, and there's definitely a demand on the part of students. One thing I also always want to emphasize, and I do this in my classes, is that the field wouldn't exist if it weren't for student activists, right? That it's never been the case that, a university president said, I think we need to have a class in Chicano studies, or I think we need to have a class in Black feminism. It's not how it happens, right? So, and so really I credit, in the courses that I teach, even, the career that I have is really thanks to student activists who came, well before me, and who really put their own education, their own graduation, possibilities on the line. So so it has continued to grow. So whether or not it's understudied, I think it depends. I think it takes, I think at smaller schools there's maybe less offerings, but I don't want to paint small schools as not having courses, sort of diverse course offerings. So I do think it's growing, and the field is changing, right? And so one change might even be the ways in which I think 20, 30 years ago, the field was really largely shaped by Chicano studies, and that makes sense in terms of U.S. demographics, but that has changed, right? So now you find Central American studies, and you find, sort of more diversity within that large umbrella term. In terms of my own research process, so I sort of talked a little bit about sort of like things that interested me and that I wanted to look for, and that really, I think, inspired, probably like my first 3 books. And I can sort of tell that story differently. But I think a lot of times what I do right now, because I'm a literature scholar, I really have the great privilege of sort of like reading things that interest me and then wanting to write on them, and seeing sort of what piques my interest, what I think. I do try to look at things that are not spoken about. So I tend to not work on like canonical authors. So sometimes people will say to me, name an author that you write on, and I sometimes say, well, the whole reason I'm writing on them is that you haven't heard of them, right? So I tend not to write on like the biggest names, like Sandra Cisneros, right, is a big name, or Julia Alvarez, and those are great writers, and I teach them, but my scholarship doesn't tend to focus on people, the writers that are already bestsellers and things like that. I do try to focus on folks that receive less attention but deserve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like that's a form of activism in itself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, but could you tell us more about like your participation in student activism, like when you were a student as well?
Sure. Yeah. So as an undergrad, I was involved in sort of like anti-globalization protests. That's what we would have called them then. I don't know what we would call them now. And feminist activism and environmental activism. And then as a grad student, I was involved in those things as well as labor organizing. Anti-war activism.
Right.
And I love how you brought up that historical context of how these fields were birthed out of student activism. I'm curious, what do you think about how we see now that, I don't want to get political, but you see that there is national conversation on, erasure or removal of certain courses, or like humanities courses and courses that focus on, subjects such as like African American studies and, Latin American studies, and, in terms of like, K-12 education, right? That like it's becoming like really politicized. We see that just education itself, and just like having access to these types of courses are becoming politicized. Like, what do you think about that? How do you see this playing out in the future in terms of like how politicized these courses are becoming in terms of like just the education landscape as a whole, like not just tertiary education, but we see like K-12.
No, there's a lot of fight around like ethnic studies at the high school level, right? There are courses. I do every once in a while have students who've taken a women's and gender studies course as a high school student, but mostly they haven't.
That's amazing.
Yeah, sometimes I ask them, how did you end up here? I took a class like this in high school. And then, there are places. There's a huge fight in Arizona, which I think is still ongoing around ethnic studies in high school classes. People accuse the curriculum of being anti-American, and we see that debate, right? That like if we want to talk about the unsavory aspects of U.S. history, that often is branded, anti-American. One experience that I have a lot of times with my students is they're angry that they didn't learn these things, right? They come to my class, and a lot of, like my Latino students, will say, well, I never learned this, right? Like, I wasn't even taught my own history. So that is something that I experience. And I think one thing that I see happening, I'm sure you've probably seen this as well too, I think, so yeah, whether or not I think those things are going to go away, I don't think they're going to go away, unfortunately. I do think I think it's a lot of it's generational, right? We do see in terms of like legislators and like legislation, like who's proposing to do away with ethnic studies courses. I do think it's folks who probably need those classes the most, first of all, which is unfortunate. But it tends to be coming from, I do think, largely an older generation. But I do think that the reality of our world is that we do need these courses. So what I start to say is, I feel like I see a lot of people around me being like, Palestine, like, what's going on with that? Like, why don't I know about that? What's the history? I thought this, and like you see this hunger because people, there's these major events happening that are totally implicated. We are totally implicated in terms of the United States in our involvement. And people just don't, they're thirsty for that knowledge, and they deserve it and they need it. And so I think we would do a disservice to do away with those courses.
Okay, thank you. And looking at your recent book chapter, we made note of some really interesting excerpts and statements that really facilitate a lot of like thought, and I just really want to ask you about it. We both want to ask you about it. One of the statements you made, and you talked about the term Latinx, and the motivation for the usage and how it was coined. And you say like to simply assume that Latinx is the new way to refer to Latinos without doing the extra work of interrogating norms around gender and sexuality at best robs the word of its more radical origins and at worst co-ops the peoples and identities that gave rise to it. End of quote. Why do you believe this is so, and do you find that this is the norm when it comes to the adoption of this term by the masses, including its usage in popular culture? If so, why do you think this is so?
Okay, yeah. So I'll just talk a little bit about this book chapter. So I was asked to write, I would almost call this like a sort of like state of the field. I was asked to write sort of what's going on in Latinx and Chicanx literature. And so I decided to write about three things. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about the X, right? That's something that's definitely going on, so let me sort of survey. I mean, the first section is really, I do put my own spin on it, but some of it is just sort of surveying, like, here's what people are saying about this term. Like, here are the pros and cons. So that's about the first third of the article. And I thought it was just sort of useful to put it out there for people to have a sense of, how we got here. And so I do think, that the term Latinx has been, I do think it's used, like you've heard it before. So it is largely used, certainly on college campuses. Certainly, I think it can be a sort of generational thing. And I think people are well aware of the gendered implications behind it, right? I think people are well aware of the fact that the reason, one of the reasons that the term has been adopted is that Spanish is gendered, and that all genders become subsumed under the masculine gender when we do talk about plurals, right? So Latinos would stand for all Latino people, regardless of their gender. And so clearly, folks who are female, folks who are gender fluid, folks who are transgender, that term, the way the language has been used doesn't work for them. So we have the term Latinx. So I think people understand that, the gendered implications behind it. But I don't know that it's always used that way, right? So one example would be, again, we'll just take a college class example. So if somebody were to say, well, this is a Latinx history class, and that's the title, but then the actual content is really just history of male leaders. Well, then there's a disconnect there, right? It's not actually a Latinx history class; it's a Latino history class. So just call it what it is, right? So that was sort of my point: is that if you're not really, as I said, like doing the work, like if this term is supposed to help us and give us the language to be gender inclusive, But if you're just sort of using the word but not actually being gender inclusive, then what's the point?
Right.
Just go ahead and call it what it is. Like, so if you want to have an anthology of only female writers, fine. Then and they all identify as women, then call it Latina, then call it a Latina anthology. There's no need to bother with the term X. That was just one thing I wanted people to think about.
Yeah. And Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's a interesting point. And you also mentioned not just like gender exclusion in this term, but you also touch on kind of like ethnic exclusion as well, right? And racial exclusion that you think is facilitated often in use of the term. You state that the X then and I quote, you also state the X then references legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and enslavement and gestures to the racial politics at play in the term as well. Scholars have argued for the term's ability to require a recognition of indigeneity and blackness and concomitant reckoning with racism and anti-blackness within Latinx communities, end of quote. Are you relaying that you believe the term is often used in a manner that produces violence against Black subjects through the exclusion? If so, why do you think this is so? And do you find that progress is being made towards the recognition of Black subjects and anti-Blackness being required or embodied in the usage of this term? If so, how and what capacity do you see this progress is evident?
Yeah. So to sort of come at it from the side, I do think that the term Latino and like discourses of Latinidad are oftentimes very much reproducing anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, within the communities that they supposedly represent. So, and that's not an original discussion, right? That's not even for me. Black scholars have made this point quite forcefully, and Indigenous scholars have made this point. And so, because historically, the idea of a Latino race, which we actually know doesn't exist, right? Latinos are multiracial people. So that idea has often been as sort of put forth as based on mestizaje, which is like racial mixture. And it's oftentimes this sort of neat little package. Oh, like we're all mixed, so we're all the same, right? And usually the mixture is usually only discussed in terms of indigeneity, Indigenous communities and European communities. Oftentimes the existence of African and Asian communities is just totally ignored. So that's in and of itself is already exclusive. But even that fails to recognize, the ongoing, settler colonialism in the Western Hemisphere, ongoing, anti-Indigenous bias within, a lot of the Western Hemisphere. So I do think to use your terms, I do think that the discourses of Latinidad, like Latino-ness, have been anti-Black and have been anti-Indigenous. Whether or not I think we can sort of like use those terms to then recuperate that conversation. I think so. I'm not like I still use the word Latino. I haven't I find it useful. I haven't thrown it away myself. I do think so there are some scholars who, as you quoted, appreciate the Latinx because the way it sort of disrupts all of that. The idea is that it's doing not just a gender disruption, but also a racial disruption. And then harking back, we think about, somebody like Malcolm X, right, who took who uses the X as also a way of marking himself and saying, this is the way I am marking myself as a descendant from enslaved people. I'm calling out that history. So the X, I think, it means different things for different people, but it could also be a way of sort of in your face, like it doesn't fit, right? We're going to call it out. We're not going to just be like swept under the rug. There are really, there's a whole sort of discourse, coming out of Black communities. You can find like on Twitter or just like popular press, Black activists who say I'm not Latino. Like that word actually, does violence, and that doesn't fit my identity because I have been excluded from the community so much. So it does become a sort of question, can we then change it to, can we still use these words and recuperate them? Which ultimately is going to be a sort of personal, that's going to be a personal project.
It's interesting that you brought up the Malcolm X example, because I did make note of your quote in the chapter where you said on page 186, the letter X also suggests a radical politics on defiance of Anglo terms, harkening back to the defiant self-naming and rejection of imposed names by figures such as Malcolm X. That's interesting that you brought up because X does kind of make a statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just kind of like set a tone, like we are pushing back against, some type of exclusion, right? That's why I put the X on it. So just like you brought up, and maybe think about the term more in depth. But even within that, you said there's still some exclusion being facilitated with the usage of the term.
Yeah. I mean, one of the arguments against the term is like it doesn't make linguistic sense, right? Like it's not a real word. And then like, you can say, okay, yeah, but like none of these are like. I mean, language is always changing. I have all kinds of response to that. And also like, so you could say like, oh, like Malcolm X, like X isn't a last name. And he's like, well, it is what I want it to be, So there is, I think in the fact that you sort of make people like pause and think and like talk to you about it, I think can be really productive. And then we get into the part, like when you go into the language part, like, oh, but it's not even a real world, but like, well, Spanish is an imposed language, right? So I mean, even the fact that we are all conversing in English, right? This is a language that I think has, come to us through colonialism and imperialism, and clearly Spanish has the same legacy. So I don't really buy these arguments. I don't give too much credence to some sort of like linguistic purity arguments.
This kind of like, in validation of like language, or like putting language in a certain, like a hierarchy, which is considered good, proper language, or this is, which is often rooted in like white supremacy, what is considered official language, that's interesting. Even we see that even in regions where it is made up of majority of colonized people are descendants of slaves or descendants of people who were like subjected, who were colonized. There's still this white supremacy is still upheld in what is determined like official language, and that's interesting that you brought it up. Into that. So I didn't know you had Michelle had mentioned some of your projects that I found really interesting too.
Yeah, so I know that you're also working on a new project now about migrant mothers. Like, could you tell us more about that? Like, what inspired it? Like, what's going on with that right now?
Yeah. Okay, so actually, like a good academic, I have like 3 projects and going simultaneously. And so I was starting this project on migrant motherhood, and I co-authored an article a few years ago. I think it came out in 2017 that looks at the portrayal of the mother figure in a YA text called "The Distance Between Us" by Ariana Vigil. It's a really nice text if you ever have a chance to read it. But I'm sort of shifting gears and doing a different project right now.
Tell us everything.
So I'm working, I think now where I have very slowly, but where I'm trying to put some more energy is to a project on loss, which is actually not unrelated to motherhood. So I'm looking, I want to do a project on Latinx literature and loss, and I want to look at 2 different kinds of loss. One being maternal loss, so such as like miscarriage and the loss of children, or the inability to have children, so loss in terms of like fertility and motherhood, and then also looking at loss in terms of climate change, ecological loss and devastation, and clearly these things are related, and sort of just looking at how Latino authors are sort of putting things together. And I've been, one of the people I'm inspired by is Ada Limon, who is the maybe I think she's still, or maybe her year has ended, U.S. Poet Laureate, first ever Latina Poet Laureate. And she has some really great collections of poetry, and she talks a lot about she talks about infertility, and she talks about like the loss of landscape and the loss of motherhood. So that's the project I'm working on now.
Oh, that's super cool. Are you like conducting interviews or doing this academic research or literature reviews right now?
I'm mostly in the literature review stage. So it's slow going because I have a heavy administrative burden, but that's my aspirational project, is to one day, I think in a couple of years I'll probably finish it up. But yeah.
Wow, I feel like that's a very interesting and also vulnerable topic to talk about, especially like loss in all terms of ways, I think it's really interesting that you focus on that. I also wanted to ask about your other experiences with your other institutions as well, and how that's different across time. So you started out at Ohio State, then went to Cornell, and now you're here at UNC. Like, could you tell us more about like the programs and the differences? And I feel like you've experienced a lot, so.
Okay, yeah. So I'll go back to my academic biography. So I did my undergrad at Ohio State, and then I went straight into a joint MA PhD program at Cornell University, where I did a PhD in English and in literature, and I had graduate minors in feminist, gender, and sexuality studies and Latino studies. And when I graduated, my first job was at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And so there I was hired into the English department, and I was a joint hire in the Department of English and the Institute for Ethnic Studies. And I was really happy to be there. I was really happy to have my interdisciplinarity recognized, to have that joint appointment. And I was also affiliated with the Women's Studies program there. And after 3 years there, I moved here to Carolina. So I moved from a joint appointment in English and Ethnic Studies to now Women's and Gender Studies. So I feel like I've been in pretty much every department I could be in. And I do feel... I do like the interdisciplinary department, I will say. I don't know that I would ever go back to a traditional English department again. I would probably go to another Women's and Gender Studies program if I were to change jobs, or go to a Latino Studies or Ethnic Studies, because that is, I think, what I do and who I am. I don't know about those things.
Yeah, just like, what makes a department stand out? What makes it work? I think especially,
Key differences.
Right?
Yeah, I really just think, sort of students and student support. I mean, so here we have a really, we are a department, we offer a major and a minor and a graduate certificate. And so we have really enthusiastic students. Our courses fill every semester.
Nice.
So yeah, I think like the strength and robustness of our program here at Chapel Hill really comes from our students.
Wow. Gotcha. And as a chair, like, how does that change, like, your administrative duties? Like, what does that consist of?
I don't get to see students that much, actually. That's the interesting thing. So whenever I look at the list of graduating students now, so I teach less because I have a teaching reduction because I'm chair. And I always joke and say, but I love teaching, right? And so I do need to have some sort of reduction in order to be able to take on my administrative role. But I always say, like, I wish I could just have like an email reduction. Can I just have like 30% less email, and then I would be fine. I would be fine with teaching my usual load, but that's not possible. So, but yeah, so I do. I love, but I do because I teach one class a semester now instead of two. I meet like 50% less of the students, and that's actually sad. So a lot of times at graduation, when I'm handing out. When I'm congratulating the graduates, sometimes I don't even know them, and that would have been different 3 or 4 years ago. When I definitely, like every graduate who come through our program, I usually would have some frame of reference. They would have been in one class with me, so it's unfortunate.
Well, you can still meet a lot of students.
A
lot of students will come to you just like us. Do you have like a vision as chair about how you want to shape the future of the department?
Yeah, we're really interested. So we're hiring right now. We're conducting a search. So one of the things I'm doing right now is reviewing job applications. And so, we're interested in growing our department, continuing to diversify our department. So we're hoping to do a hire in LGBTQ studies or Black feminisms. That's what we're hoping to do.
That's super cool. Yeah. I mean, I feel like under your leadership, it'll go great. I also want to talk about like some of your personal hobbies and everything.
Okay.
Like, I know that you have a blog and you like to post like cooking recipes and like vegan recipes. Like what inspired that, and like about veganism too, if you could talk more about it.
Okay. Oh, I love veganism. Sure. Yeah. So I've been vegan for over half my life. I've been vegan when I was about 20 years old.
Oh, wow.
And so, I did start this blog. I don't update it very often, as you can see, but I do have some silly, like, vegan cookies and things like that. So I do a lot of sort of, I think, I'm both sort of critical of this, but I think I also sort of do it like lifestyle activism, right? And so sort of thinking about, like, what is my impact on the world, and, what changes can I make that I want to see in the world, and like sort of what can I involve in my life. So I try to, today, like I bike to campus, I try to, I lived without a car for many, many years. I do own a car now, but I still, am pretty good. I've lived in several cities in the United States where people said you can't live there without a car, including here, and I lived there without a car just fine.
Right.
So I enjoy that, and thinking a lot about climate change and our impact on the world. And so for me, veganism is about that, and also thinking about like how we treat the people that pick our food, how we treat the people who prepare our food. So that for me also brings in questions of like labor justice and economic inequality, in addition to questions of climate justice.
That's so interesting. Like, it's not even just about you; it's about how you chose veganism, not just because of how it would affect you, but also how it affects other people. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I would think. Actually, I would say like sort of health is probably like very low on my list, and interesting enough, actually. In a strange way, like animal welfare is also sort of low on my list, right? If you notice, like I didn't really mention that. I mean, of course, like I don't want to eat animals, but really I was sort of motivated in terms of like these larger scale processes that are very related.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to look at veganism.
Right, yeah. I feel like it's pretty admirable too.
It's very admirable.
And especially when you're thinking about how you're doing a project on loss and climate change, like I can see how it's inspired.
Yeah, it does. Although, I was having this conversation with my students because we were talking, I'm teaching a class on activism right now. And so we did a day on climate activism. And I was telling them, I am also frustrated by, like, I think we're pretty well aware of like, okay, well, I can make a change by like recycling. I can make a change by, not, consuming less fossil fuels or whatnot. But really like, our individual actions are like a drop in the bucket, right? It's really like, how do we get, that chemical company to stop dumping into the rivers, right? And how do we get, Congress to actually pass some sort of comprehensive legislation? So that's why I'm both like, I try to do things, but I'm also critical, or, like I think sort of, cognizant of the ways in which like we have to be thinking about systemic change alongside individual actions.
And not just from like an immediate standpoint, but like from a long-term standpoint. That's pretty interesting, right? Not just think about like just us, right? And just individually what we do, but how we can get the bigger powers to do their part to address the issue.
Yeah.
Like you said, what we do is just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
But that's really great. Yeah. Well, do you have anything else?
Not really. I think it was great learning about your work and your your hobbies, and so I just want to thank you so much for talking with us today. I think we both learned a lot.
Yes, we did. Thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you.
I know you have a very busy schedule.
Thank you.